welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be looking into whether large language models can think like statisticians.
Like, can they use data to predict things,
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's right. We'll be diving deep into a research paper to try to understand this whole idea.
Okay.
It's called Enough Coin Flips Can Make LLMs Act Bayesian by Gupta et al., published in 2025.
Coin flips. That sounds a lot simpler than I expected.
Yeah, well, the researchers used these coin flips as a way to test how LLMs actually learn.
Okay.
Think of it like this. You have a bag of marbles, but you have no idea how many are red and how many are blue.
All right, I'm with you.
So you reach in and grab a handful.
Okay, so like I pull out a few and...
Yeah, and let's say most of those marbles are red.
Okay.
You'd probably start to think that there are more red marbles in the bag overall, right?
That makes sense.
So that's kind of what they did with the LLMs, but using coin flips.
Using coin flips instead of marbles. Interesting.
Yeah, so the big question was, could the LLMs update their beliefs about the fairness of the coin based on the results of the flips?
Okay, I see. So if they saw a bunch of heads come up, they'd think, okay, this coin might be biased towards heads.
Exactly. And that's a really key part of what statisticians call Bayesian reasoning.
Oh, okay. So is that like what we're looking at here? Are these LLMs acting like they have a statistics textbook hidden somewhere?
Well, not quite. It turns out that most of the LLMs, when they were asked to predict the coin flip outcomes initially, they showed a bias towards heads.
Hold on. So you're saying these advanced AI systems have a favorite side of a coin?
It is pretty surprising, isn't it?
That's kind of funny.
It is. It suggests that they don't always start with that perfectly neutral 50-50 understanding, like we might expect.
Yeah, you think they'd be a little more impartial.
Right.
So what did the researchers do? Did they try to teach the models to be fair?
They did. They tried to explicitly tell the LLMs about the bias of the coin.
Okay, and so how did they phrase that?
So for example, they might say something like, this coin lands on heads 75% of the time.
Okay, so they're giving them a very clear instruction.
Right.
And did that work?
Well, this is where it gets kind of interesting.
Okay.
It didn't always work.
Really? Yeah.
Yeah, some LLMs, especially the ones that weren't specifically trained to follow instructions, they kind of just stuck with that heads bias.
So some of them were a little stubborn, I guess.
Yeah. And, that gives us a little bit of a clue about how the LLMs are learning.
How so?
Well, their initial training data, that huge amount of information they learned from it can really create a strong starting point for their beliefs.
I see.
Even when they're given new information that kind of contradicts it.
So they're kind of set in their ways in a sense.
Yeah, a little bit.
But you said some models did better,
Yeah.
right? What made them different?
The models that did better were the instruction-tuned ones.
Okay.
So these are LLMs that have been specifically trained to follow directions, and they were much more likely to actually adjust their predictions based on what the researchers told them.
Interesting.
Especially when that bias was really extreme, like 100% heads.
So giving clear instructions does matter then?
It does, but it's not the whole story.
Okay, so there's more to it than that.
Right, and that's what led the researchers to try something different.
What was that?
Something called in-context learning.
In-context learning.
Oh, yeah. So instead of just telling the LLMs about the bias, they showed them a series of actual coin flips, right there in their prompts.
So instead of saying, this is how it is, they were giving them examples.
Yeah. It was like giving them examples to learn from.
Okay. So learning by doing rather than just by being told.
Exactly.
That's interesting. And that's where we'll pick up in part 2. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. So last time we were talking about how LLMs can be a bit stubborn when it comes to coin flips.
Yeah, they definitely have their quirks.
But then you mentioned something called in-context learning.
Right.
What happened when the researchers tried that?
Okay, so instead of just, telling the LLM that a coin might be biased, they started feeding the model a series of coin flips, as part of their prompts.
Okay.
It was like showing them examples to help them learn.
Okay, so rather than just, lecturing them about probabilities, they were giving the LLMs some hands-on experience.
Exactly.
Did it work?
Yeah, it actually did. As the LLMs saw more and more examples of the actual coin flip distribution, their predictions started to get closer to the true probabilities.
Interesting.
It was like they were gradually correcting their initial heads bias.
Okay, so by being exposed to more data, they were able to adjust their assumptions.
Right.
But how do we know they weren't just memorizing those specific coin flip sequences?
That's a great question, and the researchers were very careful to consider that.
Okay.
They actually dug into the math behind how the LLMs were processing this information,
Okay.
and they found that the models weren't just simply mimicking the examples.
So there was something more going on than just rote memorization.
Exactly. It seems like the LLMs were actually updating their internal understanding of the coin flip probabilities with each new example.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, so even though they weren't explicitly programmed to use Bayesian statistics, they were kind of demonstrating that kind of reasoning.
That's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
But I remember you mentioned earlier that these models can be influenced by the data they're trained on.
Right.
Does that mean we need to be extra careful about what kind of data we use to train LLMs?
Oh, absolutely. This research really highlights just how important that training data is.
Okay.
If the data used to train these models contains biases, well, those biases can end up reflected in the LLM's output.
So garbage in, garbage out, as they say.
Exactly. The quality and the diversity of the training data are incredibly important, and the study just really emphasizes why we need to be so thoughtful and careful about the data that we use to train these powerful AI systems.
That makes sense. It's like teaching someone a new skill. You want to make sure they're learning from a good source.
I like that analogy.
But going back to the in context, learning this seems like a pretty promising way to help LLMs become better learners.
Yeah, it definitely seems promising. By showing LLMs these real-world examples, we can help them adapt and learn new things.
It's like giving them that hands-on experience instead of just, telling them what to do.
Right.
So instead of just reading the textbook, they get to try things out for themselves.
Exactly. And this raises some really interesting questions for future research.
Like what?
Like, what are the most effective types of examples to use for in-context learning?
Okay.
How many examples are actually needed for a model to truly grasp a new concept? There's still so much to explore.
It sounds like we're really just scratching the surface of what's possible with LLMs.
Yeah, we are.
Curious, in the paper, did the researchers dive into any other aspects of how LLMs learn?
They did. They looked into something called attention mechanisms within the LLMs.
Attention mechanisms.
Yeah.
Is that like when my cat is completely fixated on a laser pointer?
Well, kind of. In AI, attention refers to how the model focuses on certain parts of the input it's given.
Well,
It's a way for the model to prioritize which pieces of information are the most relevant.
okay.
So the researchers wanted to see if the LLMs were paying more attention to the coin flip examples that were the most helpful in learning about the true probabilities.
Okay, so if I'm understanding this correctly, they were basically trying to see if the LMs could focus on the right information.
Right, exactly.
And what did they find?
Well, this is where it gets a little surprising. They found that the amount of attention wasn't always directly correlated with how well the model learned.
Really?
Yeah.
So just because an LLM seems to be paying attention to something, it doesn't necessarily mean it's learning effectively from it.
Exactly. It turns out that there's more to the story than just attention.
Okay.
The way these models process and integrate information is incredibly complex, and we're honestly only beginning to understand it.
Yeah, I guess it makes sense that we wouldn't have it all figured out just yet. AI is a rapidly evolving field.
That's right. And this research is an important step towards understanding the nuances of how LLMs learn and reason.
So where do we go from here? What's like the big takeaway from all this?
Well, the takeaway for me is that while LLMs are incredibly powerful tools, they are still very much under development.
Okay.
They can learn in ways that are very similar to how we humans learn, but they're also susceptible to those biases, and they require careful attention to the data they are trained on.
Well, this has been fascinating. I'm really starting to appreciate the complexities of how these models work, even with something as seemingly simple as a coin flip.
Me too. It's really amazing stuff.
But before we wrap up, the paper ended with a pretty thought-provoking question for all of us.
You're right.
What was it?
The paper asks us to consider the implications of LLMs learning from the examples we provide.
Okay.
If these models are implicitly learning from us, what does that mean for the information we choose to share? What if those examples are biased or incomplete or even intentionally misleading?
Wow. That's a really big question to think about.
It is, isn't it?
It seems like we have a responsibility to be really mindful of the information we're feeding these models, because it could have a real impact on how they learn and evolve.
I agree. And that's something that we're going to explore further in part 3, where we'll dive into the broader implications of these findings and discuss what it all means for the future of AI.
Welcome back to The Deep Dive. We've been on quite a journey exploring how these LLMs learn, and last time we were left with a pretty big question to think about.
Yeah, if LLMs are learning from all the data that we feed them, we need to be really, really careful about what that data is, right?
It's kind of mind-blowing to think about that, the examples we show, LLMs could really shape their understanding of the world.
It is. And this is especially important when we think about how the diet of data that these models are getting is becoming more and more diverse.
Oh yeah, that's true. It's not just text anymore, is it?
No, no, it's not.
They're learning from images and videos and even code.
Exactly. LLMs are being trained on this vast and growing collection of information, and that kind of raises a new question of how we even define bias in such a complex data set.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's not as simple as just looking for biased language anymore, right?
Right.
So how do we make sure that these models aren't, learning harmful or misleading things from all this data?
That's like a huge area of research right now.
Okay.
We need new tools and new frameworks for understanding and mitigating bias across all these different types of data.
So it's almost like we're trying to teach LLMs to be critical thinkers,
Right.
to be discerning about the information that they consume.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. We want AI that can learn from the world, but in a way that's fair and responsible and ultimately beneficial to humanity.
Which brings us back to that marble analogy from earlier, right?
Right.
We need to understand not just the marbles we're pulling out of the bag, but the bag itself.
Exactly. Where did that data come from? How was it collected? Is it truly representative of the world we want the AI to learn about?
Those are big questions.
They are.
It sounds like we need to be really aware of the potential for selection bias.
Yes.
The idea that the data we have might not be a completely accurate picture of reality.
Absolutely. And we need to develop ways to either correct for those biases or find more diverse and representative data sources.
It's almost like we're the curators of a museum carefully selecting exhibits to tell a complete and balanced story.
I love that analogy. And just like those museum curators, we need to be constantly reevaluating our collections, making sure they're relevant and up to date and free from harmful or outdated perspectives.
Because the last thing we want is an AI that's stuck in the past, or even worse, amplifies the worst parts of humanity.
You're absolutely right. The stakes are high, but the potential benefits are huge.
Yeah.
If we can get this right, if we can teach these AI systems to learn and reason in a way that's ethical and beneficial, the possibilities are honestly limitless.
It's really inspiring to think about.
It is.
We've covered a lot of ground today, from coin flips to attention mechanisms to the vast world of AI training data.
We have.
But I think the main takeaway here is that understanding how these AI systems learn is really crucial for shaping the future that we want to create.
Absolutely. It's a responsibility that we all share.
Researchers, developers, policymakers, everyday users alike.
Everyone, because ultimately AI is a reflection of ourselves, our values, our aspirations for the future.
And I think by having these kinds of conversations, by asking tough questions and exploring different perspectives, we can help guide AI towards a path that benefits all of humanity.
Well said. We'll leave you with one final thought to ponder. If AI is learning from us, what are we teaching it? And what do we want it to learn?
That's a great question for everyone to consider. Until next time, deep divers keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.